We are so excited to engage with today's speaker. I am Hannah Riley Bowles. I have the honor of co-directing the Women and Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School with Professor Iris Bonet. We welcome you to our fall Women in Public Policy program research seminar, where we have been exploring work and family. So we've just had a terrific series of conversations about managing the boundaries of work and family, illuminating how individual agency, institutions, policies, and social norms shape our ability to thrive in both of those realms. And today we are overjoyed to be welcoming Professor Allison Daminger. Uh, Allison is an assistant professor of sociology at University of Wisconsin-Madison and author of the book, What's on Her Mind: The Mental Workload of Family Life. She has her research, which is also published in top peer-reviewed journals, focuses on how and why gender shapes family dynamics, particularly the division of work and power within couples. Her scholarship has been just, her scholarship for her dissertation has just been immediately impactful. She has won awards and captured the attention of the media, including major media such as The Atlantic, New York Times, and Psychology Today. Today, she will share with us her research on cognitive labor and the work of ensuring that family members' needs are met and their obligations fulfilled. So she will, as has been our norm, she'll speak for 45 to 50 minutes. If you have clarifying questions, you can toss them in the chat, but we're going to let her give her presentation so that we have a nice amount of time for Q&A discussion. As usual, please put your questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand. If you can come on in full form or full voice, we'd love to unmute you and have you ask your question directly to the speaker. Otherwise, I'll do my best to pass along your question. So please join me in welcoming today's speaker. Thank you so much. We're thrilled to have you here, Allison. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, for that kind introduction. It's especially delightful to be here. I am a Harvard alum. It's only been a few years since I left Cambridge, so this is a particularly exciting one for me. I have to apologize. I'm recovering from a cold. I've got an infant in daycare, and we're in the thick of the germ cycle. So if I take a quick water and cough break, I hope you'll forgive me. So I'm going to share my slides. Does that look okay? Great. All right. So, as Hannah told you, I'm here to talk about my new book, which was published in September by Princeton University Press. And it's challenging, to say the least, to try to condense a whole book into a 45-minute talk. So the approach that I've taken today is to give you a high-level overview of some of the book's core arguments, but then we're going to do a deep dive on some of the components that I personally found most interesting and surprising, and hopefully you will too. First, though, I want to start by telling you about how this project got started. Go back in your time machine to early 2017, just like a lifetime ago. Back then, I was a first-year graduate student, and I was casting around for a research project. I was looking for something that I hoped could, keep me going for the years it takes to write a dissertation. And nothing was clicking, so I had to fulfill some course requirements. And for one of them, I started conducting some pilot interviews with parents. This project never ended up going anywhere, but it was very helpful for providing the germ of what became this book. Now, my idea was to conduct interviews with parents about how they made decisions on where to send their kid to school. This was the greater Boston area, and so, again, as some of you may know, those decisions are more complex. Right? I grew up in a small town where there was pretty much one option. This was a context where parents were really actively thinking for a long time ahead of the school choice, what they were going to do. And so my thought at the time when I started conducting these pilot interviews was maybe these decision processes will tell me something about class inequality and how that gets reproduced. Instead, though, I started obsessing over pronouns. Over and over again, I heard parents tell me that we, i.e., my partner and I, had made the school decision together. But I was learning how to be a good interviewer, and being a good interviewer means you probe, you ask for specifics, and when I did that, the we quickly fell apart. Instead, it was she who realized they needed to start thinking about schools. It was she who polled her friends about how they had made choices and combed relevant internet forums for intelligence. It was she who put together a spreadsheet of viable options and then scheduled tours and open houses and made sure they got onto the family calendar. Then we attended the tours and made a final decision. Around the same time that I was conducting these interviews, I was also taking a social stratification class, and we were reading foundational texts about gender and family inequality. Among others, we read Arlie Hochschild's pioneering book, The Second Shift. I also looked at several foundational time use studies by Susan Bianchi and colleagues. And I remember thinking that, wow, these are stark gender disparities in the way that men and women are using their time. But I had a feeling that they were probably painting an incomplete picture because these studies weren't set up to capture the gender decision-making dynamics that I'd been seeing in my school choice interviews. And this made sense, right? Because sociologists had typically conceptualized decision-making as a form of power, right? They would say things like, okay, whoever gets the final say in decision A or decision B has more power in a couple, in a relationship. But what I was suspecting was that there was another side to this coin. Because prior to grad school, I worked in behavioral economics, and one of the core insights there was that decision making is cognitively taxing. You may remember there was a famous article during the Obama presidency where he talked about how he wore the same suit all the time, right, to minimize decision fatigue. So my question became, what if we recognized decision making and the associated labor leading up to that stage as a form of labor? What might this reframe teach us about how gender continues to shape family life? Now, I came to this topic inductively, but once I started thinking about it, several literatures guided the design of the study and my subsequent analysis of the data. I'm going to just touch on these briefly because I suspect they're going to be quite familiar to many of you in the audience, but I think it's important to lay this groundwork. So first, one strand of research looks at the macro level, charting population level ebbs and flows in the quality and quantity of gaps between men and women, right? When it comes to their use of time, when it comes to what they earn, the occupations they enter, their health, and so on and so forth. And overall, this research paints a mixed picture. The sociologist Paul England has summarized it as stalled and uneven progress toward gender equality. Right, stalled because in many areas of life, progress has really not budged much in the past several decades, and uneven because some dimensions we've seen more gains than others. So progress in the public sphere, for example, in the realm of paid work, is usually seen as outpacing gains in the domestic sphere or the home. Zooming in on the domestic, there's another strand of research that looks at how labor gets divided up in families. Right? That was, including the book The Second Shift, that was the work that I was reading in that social strat class. And that research very consistently shows women spend more time on housework and more time on childcare than men do. It shows that gender gaps closed pretty rapidly between roughly the 60s and the 80s, but have remained stagnant for the past 30-ish years. Further, that inequality is not fully explained by economic factors. Right? If we look at things like who earns more, who works more hours, we can't explain away the gender gaps in household labor. And finally, there's a third strand of really important feminist scholarship that called attention to the fact that labor takes many forms, right? Some of the pioneering work of Daniels, Papanek, and others said, hey, we need to think about forms of labor that resist quantification, that tends to be invisible, right? And so what I have tried to do in my work is to build and bridge these literatures. So one of the ways I do so is by bringing together the micro and the macro. I look at how individual couples are experiencing and making sense of what England has called the stalled revolution. I also try to challenge the dominant paradigm for studying unpaid labor. As I mentioned earlier, usually we do that by counting up the minutes and hours that folks are spending on these tasks. And what I say is we need to consider mind use alongside time use. And finally, I go beyond some of that earlier scholarship on hidden forms of labor to say we need to go beyond just recognizing it exists and to get really specific and concrete about what it consists of, to develop frameworks for measuring it systematically, right, that can then eventually be scaled up. And so in the book, I develop that framework and I apply it to both different gender and LGBTQ couples. So the first chapter of What's on Her Mind is all about that framework. So, I just want to introduce it to you briefly now because it's quite hard to understand any of what follows without that baseline. So what I argue is that cognitive labor constitutes a third dimension of household work. It overlaps with, but is analytically distinct from the more familiar forms of labor, like physical and emotional labor. So physical labor is what we think of when we think of housework, right? It's vacuuming a floor, it's making a meal, it's driving a child somewhere. Emotional labor, excuse me, came a little bit later, also coined by Arlie Hochschild. And that refers to the work of making sure that your feelings and your affect align with what the situation calls for. So it's the end of a really long day, but your children are screaming, your spouse is complaining about their workday. You try hard to remain cheerful, to make your family members feel heard and understood, right? Even when that is not necessarily how you are feeling in that moment. Now, the cognitive dimension I define as the set of mental processes that are aimed at figuring out what family members need, what they owe to others, and then how best to ensure that both needs and obligations are fulfilled. And to understand this dimension, we can't just port over the theories and measurement tools that we've created to study other forms of household labor. To head off any confusion, though, I want to just briefly acknowledge that you may have heard the term mental load. That's sort of the term du jour on social media. And this is a pretty new field of research, so it's still the subject of some ongoing debate in the field. But the emerging consensus seems to be that mental load refers to the intersection of cognitive labor and emotional labor. Today, though, I'm going to be focusing on the cognitive dimension. Now, this diagram shows the ideal typical form that a typical cognitive labor episode takes. So, what starts this whole thing is anticipation. Someone anticipates a need or an opportunity. That could be as simple as, what's for dinner tonight? We all need to eat. Or it could be as complex as, where are we going to send our child for school next year? Next, they need to identify their options. That might be a simple brainstorm, right? What is in the pantry? What have we already made? What takeout places have we been to recently? Or it could be a much more extensive research process, right? Let's comb the internet to find all the viable school options. Then they have to make a decision. They choose something among those options that they previously identified. We are going to have spaghetti for dinner. We're going to send our kid to the charter school across town, etc. Finally, they have to follow up to make sure that whatever they decided on was successfully executed and that the underlying need was addressed. So oftentimes decisions require other people, right? If I delegate something to my spouse, did he do it? If I emailed a school principal to ask if we got a spot, did I get a reply? Right? Is this new technique we're trying to deal with our toddlers' tantrums actually effective at reducing them? So to study this cognitive dimension, I engaged in an extensive data collection process. Started in 2017, continued through 2022 in 3 phases. So in total, I conducted interviews with 172 parents that represented 94 couples. And in most cases, I interviewed both partners independently. So I would talk to partner A on a Monday and then partner B on a Tuesday, for example. So phase one, I focused on different gender, college-educated couples who were raising at least one child under age 5. And I selected this group for a few reasons. Number one, I expected them to have particularly high cognitive labor demands. Now that I'm in this phase, I can confirm that is accurate. Um, I also wanted to understand how gender inequality would show up among a group that, at a high level is known to have more gender egalitarian leaning beliefs. In the second phase, I focused on different gender couples with children ages 5 to 14. I wanted to understand how cognitive labor demands would shift as kids got a little bit older. I also tried to vary the educational background of the participants as a very rough proxy for social class. Because my question, right, there was a lot of sort of conflicting data in the literature about how social class affected physical labor, and I wanted to understand how might class differences affect cognitive labor. Finally, in phase three of the research, I focused on LGBTQ couples who are raising children of any age. Because I wanted to understand, would queer couples divide or account for cognitive labor differently than cisgender and heterosexual couples would? So this is the demographics of the full sample. I want to call your attention to a few features. Number one, this is a mostly white sample and mostly US born. There was some variation here, but it's mostly white and mostly American. The average age was 38, but it ranged from 28 to 59. This is a highly educated sample. Most participants had a bachelor's degree or more. And it was also an affluent sample. The median was 155K, although it did range from 20K up to well over 500K. So what this means is that my findings should not be understood as representative of the US population. I do talk a bit in the book about some of the relatively minimal differences that I did observe by race, ethnicity, and social class. But because I don't have a sufficient sample size to really parse out those differences, that's going to have to be left to future research. All right. So I am very happy to go into my methodology in the Q&A in more detail, but here I want to just call out a few key features. Because one of the core challenges I faced in designing this study was figuring out how the heck am I going to get people to talk about a form of labor that they probably don't even think about as labor, right? That happens inside their heads. How is this going to come out in an interview? And so I did a few things that were really helpful. Number one, I had participants fill out decision diaries. So I would send them a very simple Excel form where I asked them to log all of the decisions they made or thought about making for their family over the course of the 24 hours or so leading up to our interview. And then during the interview, we talked about these logs at length, right? You said that you decided to feed your child Cheerios for breakfast. Well, tell me about how that decision came about, right? What other options did you consider? How did those options get in your pantry in the first place, etc.? In phases two and three, I had learned a lot about what cognitive labor consisted of, so I tweaked the methods a bit. Instead of a decision diary, I had people sort a deck of cards that I had printed with a range of cognitive tasks. And I asked them to tell me, okay, which of these tasks do you handle? Which of these tasks does your partner handle? Which of these do you share? Which of these does someone else do, etc. Finally, in all phases of the interviews, I structured my guide to move from the very concrete to the very abstract. Right? We started with how did you make this decision about what to feed your child for breakfast? And we ended with, how do you think about your overall division of this work in your household? Right? What do you think gender has to do with this? How fair do you feel this is? So this combination of concrete and abstract enabled me to gain a really detailed portrait of who was doing what in each household, but also to understand how participants were making sense of those patterns, right? How did they understand why they were doing what they did? And it's that why part that I'll be spending a lot of time talking about today. What's on Her Mind has 6 different substantive chapters. I'll outline them here for you before telling you what we're going to do a deep dive on today. So chapter 1 introduces cognitive labor, and it makes the case that the time use paradigm is ill-equipped to capture this portion of household life. Chapter 2 explains how the majority of different gender couples allocated cognitive work, while chapter 3 focuses on the dominant explanations they offer for their inequality. Chapter 4 gives an alternative, more sociological account of inequality in cognitive labor. And then chapters 5 and 6 explore 2 non-dominant approaches. First, among the minority of different gender couples, and second, among LGBTQ couples. I won't have time to delve into all of these today, though I encourage you to ask me about any of it in the Q&A. But I'm going to be discussing core findings from chapters 3 and 4 primarily. So here's the roadmap for this section of the talk. I'm going to start by telling you about the different gender couples in my sample. First, looking at how they allocate or divide up cognitive labor in their household. Then we'll look into their dominant account, their explanation for that allocation. And finally, I'll talk about what I believe is really driving the observed patterns. First, I want you to meet Heather and Jeremy. I'm going to use their story to illustrate some of the core themes from my interviews with different gender couples. When I interviewed them, Heather was nearing the end of a long parental leave from her research position, and she'd been spending most of her days with their infant and after school with a preschooler. Her husband Jeremy worked full-time as the manager of a large research lab, but Heather was very enthusiastic about Jeremy's participation in their home life. She said, the second Jeremy gets home, he can barely get his jacket or shoes or bag off his body before he's diving in. I mean, he's really all in, like all the time. Jeremy admitted, though, that his involvement only extended so far. He said, the expression we have is that Heather sets it up and I knock it down. She makes the list and then I execute the list. Heather and Jeremy are a pretty classic case of what I call woman-led couples, right? Meaning that in these partnerships, she did the majority of cognitive household labor. So in this case, Jeremy was heavily involved in the physical labor of running their household, but it was Heather who acted as the cognitive laborer in chief. Heather also did the majority of the physical labor, despite Jeremy's set-up knockdown distinction, but the gap between the partners was smaller in that dimension. 4 out of 5 of the different gender couples I interviewed were, like Heather and Jeremy, woman-led. That book, chapter number 5, is about the remaining 20% who are roughly split between man-led couples, where he did the majority of the cognitive labor, and balanced couples, where they roughly split it. But in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the 4 out of 5 couples. In these couples, things looked a lot like what I'd observed in those school choice pilot interviews. Couples often preferred and did make decisions together. But in many cases, the setup and follow-up work that got them to and through the decision-making stage was largely handled by the female partner. She was the one with her antenna up, constantly scanning the horizon for potential problems, opportunities, and needs. She was also the one on the back end, following up to make sure whatever they decided actually happened. In between, the work of identifying options varied a bit depending on the nature of the decision in question. Right. So if it was, something to do with technology or finances, right, that could go either way. Whereas if it was something to do with kids' social life or gift giving or shopping, like that tended to be much more female dominated. And then the decisions were shared. Going back to Heather and Jeremy, both of them acknowledged that their unequal cognitive labor allocation was suboptimal, albeit for different reasons. Heather, in particular, was hopeful that once she returned to work, things would get more even. Because it just has to be, she said. Heather admitted, though, that it wasn't particularly likely given their track record. At times, even pre-kids, she told me, I wanted to say to Jeremy, can you just worry about this? I don't want to. Right? But that, for the most part, hadn't happened. Jeremy did recognize that Heather was struggling, though, and felt bad about that. He said, I know it feels really good for her when I take mental stuff off of her plate. Ideally, I'd like to do more of that because I think that would make her happier. Neither Heather nor Jeremy, though, was particularly optimistic about change. Why? Well, in a word, personality. I asked both of them toward the end of our interview why they thought they divided up cognitive work as they did. Jeremy chalked it up to personality style. He said, Heather's a planner and is just constantly thinking about this stuff. And I wouldn't say I'm a doer necessarily, like I'm also a thinker, but I'm just more disorganized. Heather, meanwhile, put it this way. She said, over time, we've understood where our tendencies are. The Platonic ideal of a marriage where the division of labor is completely equal, that just doesn't lend itself to our personalities. I'm so much more uptight than Jeremy is. I heard stories like this one over and over again in my interviews with different gender couples. This narrative repeated often enough, in fact, that I gave it a name: personal essentialism. It's the idea that cognitive labor dynamics are a function of individual traits rather than gender norms. My respondent, Molly, gave me a great tagline for this phenomenon. She said, it's not a gender thing, it's a me thing. So, unlike classic gender essentialism, which is about attributing certain innate characteristics to men or to women, personal essentialism is about attributing those same characteristics in many cases to individuals, right? So it's not men are like X, women are like Y, it's she is like X and he is like Y. At face value, this explanation makes a lot of sense, right? We know people have different temperaments. We know those temperaments impact their choices and behaviors. But what didn't make as much sense to me was that the apparently individual personality types that my respondents were describing were so strongly gendered in ways that really did not map onto what population level data suggests. Right there, if we look across the population of men and women, there are some slight differences in temperaments, but nowhere near the extreme level that I was hearing about in my research. And in my interviews, I heard over and over again that women were type A, they were naturally organized, they were better at managing details, they were better at planning ahead, maybe a bit neurotic. Over and over again, I heard from men who were described or who described themselves as laid back, go with the flow, better at being present in the moment, maybe a bit disorganized. Over time, I gave labels to these two archetypes, right? There was a superhuman and a bumbler. And in the vast majority of woman-led couples, she was a superhuman and he was a bumbler. Now, I don't think personality is actually what's driving most of couples' division of cognitive labor, at least not to the extent that they made it out to be. And I'm going to talk about why in a minute. But I do, however, think that couples' belief in this narrative had powerful consequences, some good and some bad. So, on the more positive side, it seemed to help them keep the peace. I went into this research expecting that cognitive labor would be a source of real conflict and tension. And it was for some couples, but most of them talked about that conflict in the past tense, or it was relatively mild and popped up occasionally, but it wasn't a kind of persistent issue. And I think in part that was because of this narrative. Right? So personal essentialism helped to diffuse women's anger. Right? Their potential anger was softened because they believed that it wasn't that their husband was intentionally slacking off, it was that his brain didn't work in the same way that their brain worked. Meanwhile, men's potential guilt was diffused by their belief that it wasn't that they were adhering to outdated gender stereotypes. Rather, it was that they were making reasonable accommodation to individual difference. And again, that individual part is key. Because for the most part, I didn't hear couples making generalized statements about how men are disorganized and women are type A. Instead, they were focused on how this particular man happened to differ from this particular woman. And that's critical because most of the couples that I interviewed did not want to think of themselves as traditional, right? They wanted to think of themselves as in a fair, balanced, equal relationship. And individual differences, right? Celebrating individual personality, uniqueness, right? Those are culturally sanctioned narratives in a way that, falling into gender stereotypes, at least for the couples that I interviewed, was not so palatable. The peacekeeping power of this narrative became the clearest in cases where it fell apart. So, for example, take Ted and Colleen. They had bickered over the years about what Colleen saw as Ted's apparent blindness to things that needed to be taken care of around the house. Ted's response to this conflict was to ask Colleen to make him a to-do list. And she resisted for a while, but eventually caved and wrote one up. It was a disaster. In Colleen's words, it quickly became a list of failures. She told me I was better when I just thought Ted was incapable of seeing the things. Now that you have a list, why don't you see them? Right? So then I just threw the list away. I want to linger on that for a second. Colleen had a much easier time accepting that Ted was, quote, not programmed to see the world as she did, that there was something fundamentally different about their personalities. But when he still wasn't on top of things, despite having the list, his inaction began to appear more like a failure of effort than a limitation of his personality or temperament. Now, in addition to preventing conflict, I saw that the personal essentialist narrative also seemed to prevent couples from even attempting to change cognitive labor patterns. Bridget put it in particularly memorable terms. She said, "For our division of cognitive labor to meaningfully shift, my husband's brain would have to be different, which is not a thing I'm committed to trying to change." Now, when cognitive labor is seen as who you are rather than merely what you do, right, it's at best futile and at worst unkind to seek change. Right? If I believe that my husband's brain is just different than my brain, trying to change him is at best a fool's errand and at worst, doesn't honor who he is. And that perception became particularly apparent in the handful of cases where I interviewed couples in which a man had recently lost or voluntarily left his job. And when that happened, couples usually made some adjustments to their physical labor division, right? Circumstances had changed, he had more time. It made sense that he would take on more housework. But those same couples rarely made adjustments to their cognitive labor arrangements following his unemployment. Because while he'd gained more time, to their minds, he hadn't gained more conscientiousness, right? They saw cognitive labor as a function of inherent traits rather than temporary circumstances. And so it didn't really occur to them to try to shift things. Now, I hinted a minute ago that, I don't think personality is as big a factor as my respondents suggested. And I want to get to the part where I explain why that is. So returning to Heather and Jeremy, toward the end of our interview, Jeremy told me that he really hates the media genre that features this husband who is a bumbling idiot who doesn't know what the laundry is. It was actually from Jeremy that I got the idea for the bumbler archetype name. But what's interesting about Jeremy's statement is that he is a professional manager. He runs the administrative side of a campus research lab. He oversees staff, he tracks all the various research projects and administrative and grant deadlines in different stages of completion, and so on. And so I really doubted that he would have lasted very long in that job if he was as bumbling as he suggested in our interview. So what's going on here? Right? My interviewees were focused on traits and personality. But my read of the data was that cognitive labor is primarily a function of your skills. And what I saw was that men and women were investing differently in building up really family-specific skills and capacities. And then when it came to more general capacities, they were deploying those they did have in distinct ways between paid work and home life. So on the investment side of things, I heard often from men like Matteo, who told me that his wife, he said, "My sense is that my wife will always be ahead of me, mentally prepared to do the next necessary step in our daughter's development." And she had all the knowledge, he said, about things like how to introduce solids or how to handle a sleep regression. And he described it as though it was almost instinctual, right? But when I talked to his wife, Leah, she told me there's actually a much more prosaic source of my knowledge. She had done extensive reading of parenting content, right? And made it a point to be always looking ahead and saying, okay, our daughter is almost 2. What happens at the 2-year-old stage? That's just one example of the way that women tended to invest earlier and more heavily in building up the context-specific skills and capacities that enabled them to most effectively handle their family's cognitive labor, and particularly parenting-related cognitive labor needs. Another was that women disproportionately invested in building up relationships with their child's teacher and pediatrician, with their kids' friends' parents, and so on. Those relationships laid the groundwork for things like scheduling play dates, dealing with behavioral problems. They also exposed women to more information about community norms, right? What is the acceptable gift to bring to the kindergarten birthday circuit? Where are the swim schools in town to avoid versus really make a point to get into? And finally, women were also more likely to be constantly scanning their environment for things that might in turn be helpful to their family life. They got ideas for new snow gear for watching while watching other kids on the playground, right? They saw something else that another parent was doing and made a mental note to try and work it into their own repertoire. On the deployment side, the skills it takes to be a good cognitive laborer overlap quite a bit with what psychologists call executive function. Things like self-control, working memory, mental flexibility, and so on. And what I saw was that the same men who seemed to struggle to anticipate domestic needs or to follow home projects through to completion were frequently quite successful in occupations that required those very same skills. So I've already told you about Jeremy, the lab manager who bumbled at home. There was also Trevor, right? He described himself as very scattered. He told me that, I have this tendency to forget that getting the clean clothes out of the dryer and folding them is also part of doing laundry. But he also founded and ran a nonprofit. There was Julian. His wife told me this extensive story about how before they moved in together, he was in an apartment and there was a literal hole in the wall for maybe 6 months that he had just filtered out of his mind. But he was a pediatric surgeon. Some of these men seem to recognize this contradiction during the course of our interview. When they did, they usually explained that their paid work was too draining. So Jeremy said, if I had the type of job that I cared less about, or that was less demanding in the background of my thinking at all times, then I would be more of a mental participant at home. My job just crowds out a lot of this stuff, unfortunately. Now, most of the women I interviewed were employed, and many of them had mentally draining jobs. But they put a very different spin on things. So Bridget, who was a project manager by trade, argued that, well, of course I project manage my home. That's what I'm good at, right? She said she'd built these skills at work. It was just obvious that she would use them at home. Other women worked hard to put up boundaries and to make sure that their paid work didn't take away from their capacity to do what they needed to at home, right? They said, if I have nothing left at the end of the workday, then something has to give on the paid employment front. Sometimes that meant making career shifts, right? Cutting back their hours, moving to a more family-friendly department. The idea that they could just sort of say, I used it all up at work, didn't seem to occur to most of them. Now, sometimes when I present these findings, I get the sense that people are really judging the men that I interviewed. Online, terms like weaponized incompetence get thrown around a lot, right, implying that men are feigning incapacity in order to get out of doing the work. And I saw some of that in my data, but I actually think something much bigger than individual men's intentions is at play here. One is gendered accountability structures, right? That is, society still holds men and women, mothers and fathers, to very different standards. Women are still the ones held primarily accountable for domestic outcomes. Meanwhile, men are the ones who are held primarily accountable for financial outcomes. And these kinds of accountability structures also help us explain what I saw as sometimes women selectively deploying their skills. So women who managed most other aspects of their lives with pretty exacting precision, sometimes seemed remarkably laid back about their finances or the way their yard looked. Right? So one of my respondents, Lisa, is like, I have no idea who last mowed the lawn or, last dealt with that, right? Even as she was, timing her daughter's extracurricular schedule down to the minute. So I think that consciously or unconsciously, or maybe somewhere in between, most men and women were deploying their limited cognitive bandwidth in ways that reflected the outcomes that they expected to be held accountable for. Additionally, I found that social norms put constraints on how easily accessible certain parenting spaces were to men versus women. So one man told me that he'd need to steal his wife's iPad in order to learn about local kid-friendly events because she was part of a mom's group on Facebook that gave great advice and there was nothing comparable for dads. So what ultimately happens, right, regardless of how intentional or conscious these investment and deployment patterns are, the net result seemed to be that woman-led couples were not merely responding to personal differences when they allocated cognitive labor. Instead, their allocation choices helped to create and sustain those differences. Right, so over time, our gender differentiated behaviors actually create gender differentiated selves. Now, the social forces like the gendered accountability structures and norms that nudged most women led couples down this path were not determinants, right? And I don't have time to dive into it now, but I did interview a number of couples where he did more, right? Or they managed to split it. And I'm happy to talk about what I saw that was different in those couples in the Q&A. For now, though, I want to briefly summarize my argument before I turn to some of the implications of this work. So I showed that the majority of different gender couples are woman-led, meaning that she does most of the cognitive labor. My interviewees, for the most part, recognize this inequality and saw it as suboptimal, but they chalked it up to personality. And this personal essentialist account seemed to help keep the peace and prevent conflict, but also to keep couples stuck in patterns of change that one or both of them disliked. Now, when I looked at the data, I saw that these inequalities were as much a function of skills as they were of traits. And gender was very much involved in the way that men and women invested in building skills and the way they deployed the skills they did have. So what does all of this mean? Well, on the research side of things, I think that if we want to understand how gender operates among contemporary families, we need a sociology and a social science of mind use as well as time use. The tools that have served us very well in the study of physical household labor are just poorly set up to capture the distribution of cognitive labor. It's nearly impossible to translate this kind of work into clock time, right? And when we do, I don't think we do a great job of really understanding how this work impacts people. That said, right, I had a small sample, non-representative, and it's been really exciting over the last few years to see some teams who are developing quantitative measures of this concept and starting to apply it at scale. And my hope is that, this opens up the door to answering a number of new questions. So one of those is, how does this replicate at scale? Another is how do these dynamics play out in different demographic groups? Further, what are the long-term consequences of having a heavy cognitive labor load? How does that affect your health and well-being, your relationship, longevity, etc.? I also think that the findings on personal essentialism in particular help to really crystallize for me some of the contradictions that are in our current moment. Because on one hand, many couples are told that balance, quality, mutuality are the ideal they should be striving for. And on the other, they're also confronted by cultural and structural forces that make that equality very difficult to achieve. And so in this way, personal essentialism I see as a very creative way of resolving this bind, right? It seems to be sort of a 21st century equivalent of what Hochschild called a family myth, right? A story that helps us feel okay with our current situation and our constraints. Unfortunately, right, it doesn't get rid of the gender inequality. It just sends it underground where it's harder to deal with. Now, I know this group is particularly interested in policy, so I want to close with a few ideas about the policy and practice implications of this work. First, though, I want to call out the fact that, it's been exciting to see how mental load and cognitive labor have sort of exploded around the internet in recent years. But one of the limitations of the current conversation is that it tends to be very individually focused, right? It tends to be, how do we get men to step up? How do we get women to lower their standards? And so on. And as a sociologist, my training leads me to look at these problems very differently, right? Those are good questions, but I think we also need to be asking, how can we change the conditions that are currently making it so hard for couples to achieve their egalitarian aims? They have them. And further, how do we make running a household less cognitively taxing, period? Right? Not just redistributing the existing labor, but taking it off the family unit entirely. So when we reframe the problem that way, I think it points us toward a different and more expansive set of solutions. So I think, some of the policy recommendations that you probably hear over and over in this seminar are also relevant here, right? So one example, economic inequality, right? That is one of the factors that has driven the intensification of parenting norms over the past several decades, right? And as parenting norms intensify, so too do the cognitive demands that are placed on parents. Another example is protecting workers, right? So the on-call and greedy nature of many jobs helps to shape the choices that couples are able to make, right? We don't necessarily want employers dictating how families share labor, but the expectations they have of workers definitely has an impact on what families can do. Now, we also really need to increase support to families for a lot of reasons, right? But including the fact that so much of our current system puts work onto individual households and does so in a way that is often quite complex and difficult rather than simple and easy. So Hurd and Moynihan talk about this as administrative burden, right? I would frame it as, a form of cognitive labor, right? If you ever wrestled with a health insurer or tried to figure out how to sign up for a certain benefit, you've experienced this. And then we also need to really rethink some of the systems that are ostensibly set up to support families, but often end up exacerbating underlying problems. So one example is childcare, right? We have a system that is highly fragmented, very privatized, and quite poorly aligned with standard employment schedules. Having just been through a childcare search myself, I can confirm that the work of finding a high quality, affordable daycare, for example, is very difficult. And my data suggests that most of the time, women are the ones bearing the brunt of that within households. Once kids get to be school age, right, there's a new set of problems. Our employment schedules do not align with school calendars. So our system generates considerable cognitive labor overhead, and much of that is borne by women. So policies that can make systems easier to navigate, can provide more protection to families, are also going to help with this cognitive labor problem. I could keep going in this vein, but I do want to stop here so that we've got plenty of time for discussion. I'm immensely grateful for your time and for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Fabulous. Thank you. Um, I'm got a message that I'm unmuting, and I know I'm already unmuted. That was terrific. And I doubt you've been able to watch the chat, but it's humming with praise and enthusiasm. And I'd love to maybe we can start off with some of the questions that are in the chat, and I'd love to get some other people into the conversation. It was really terrific, Allison. A lot of people are commenting on how much your research resonates with their own personal experience. Let me bring in Josephine. Josephine Arnfred, are you able to unmute or should I read your question? And give her a moment. I'm going to jump ahead and you can just interrupt me, Josephine, if you're able to unmute. But she said, could you talk? Oh, she said, I love, love, love this presentation. So a lot of enthusiasm. Thank you. And then she says, can you talk a little about the future research you mentioned with a more representative sample? And are you thinking about more quantitative work on this? You referenced some of the other work that's been going on in other labs. What do you think that might look like? And then I'm sorry, Josephine, I should have read further. She said she's not able to talk out loud as she's in an open office space. So yeah, can we start
Yeah,
there?
so thank you, Josephine. That's a great question. So it's some of this work is published, and if you email me afterward, I can send you some of the published papers, and some of it is in process. Um, so far, one of the core challenges has been figuring out how to measure this. So as I talked about, the traditional tools don't do a great job. So I've seen researchers taking a couple different approaches. One is they will do kind of an inventory, right? What I did with the deck of cards, they have a list of cognitive tasks and they ask participants to the survey to, indicate, do you do this? Does your partner do this? Is this shared, etc.? And then they aggregate up a share from there. Um, Others have sort of overall questions where they ask people to assess, how do you think overall you do this work, right? Do you do 50%, do you do 60%, etc. Um, so the precise outcomes vary depending on the measures, but so far everything I've seen suggests that what I found in this qualitative sample in terms of women in different gender couples doing the majority holds up when we scale upward. And there's also been some work suggesting that that has negative effects. There's some really interesting findings that show that when women in particular have a heavier cognitive labor load, that has negative consequences for their well-being. But curiously, it doesn't seem to negatively affect men in the same way. And so I think that's a really interesting finding and one that I'm hopeful researchers will dig into further.
Actually, could you say that one more time, Allison? What's the part that's where is the differential coming for the, yeah.
Yeah, so it's the relationship between having a heavy cognitive labor load and your well-being, right? So it seems to negatively affect women's well-being more than it negatively affects men's well-being.
And then and can they differentiate between the main effect and like is the slope different or is it just that the women are doing more?
No, it's the slope is different. So when you
Oh, okay. Oh,
control
wow. So
for
even
men
though women are
doing,
taking this
yeah,
on the margin, they actually feel for every increment, they actually are feeling it as more stressful.
yeah.
That's very interesting. Let me unmute. We've got a seminar room that some people join us from. And we had one question from the seminar room, and then I'd love to go back to the chat here. Can you guys unmute in the seminar room to pose your
Yeah.
question? Terrific.
Hi, thanks. This was really fantastic and amazing work and excellent presentation. I have two quick questions. One just follows up on this question around the mental well-being, and I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about. It seems like women, in addition to all this cognitive load, as part of it are spending a lot of their social time, as you were saying, focused on their families. So, strategizing, talking to other women about different things. And I wonder how that might mean that they're not talking about their own mental health or their own careers or their own interests. So just if you have anything to say, and then just I wonder how this might connect to the work like Lise Vesterland, who presented earlier in the year on how women are already, we know, doing a lot of the, I guess, cognitive load and unrecognized labor at work, the sort of non-promotable tasks. So they're doing all this extra work at home and then they go to work and they're doing these non-promotable tasks and how it might overlap and lead to burnout or other you know, undesirable outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so yes, I'm familiar with the work on office housework and things like that. And I I while I have not in my own research looked direct, like I talked with participants about their work lives, but it wasn't enough of a focus for me to say confidently from my data that yes, there are these compounding effects. I think that We know from mine and others' research that women are bearing most of the load at home. We know from others' research that they are bearing most of this load at work. And so it's very intuitive to me to suggest that there would be these compounding effects, right? Of feeling like your work, you're working hard, and that work is not visible and appreciated, right? So one of the things that I didn't draw out in this presentation is that, I think some aspects of this work are more closely tied to power, right? When you are making decisions, you get to shape the trajectory of your family, right? When you are anticipating other people's needs, right, that is a much, further from power, so to speak, right? And so it was striking to me that the decision part was the most shared piece of this equation, whereas the anticipating and the monitoring were the least shared and the most female-dominated portions of the equation. So I think it's that, visibility and underappreciation that probably compound the sense of burnout. And I don't know of studies that have really looked cross-domain in this way, but I hope they're forthcoming. And then on your first question, yeah, so I think this is I was actually talking, my mom came to one of my book talks this fall, and we were talking afterward about how she felt like she didn't understand why, but for whatever reason, she had a hard time relaxing, tending to her own needs until she felt confident that everyone else's needs were met. And I think that, that's definitely something that seems to persist into younger generations. I know I feel that sometimes. And so my sense is that in the sort of, hierarchy, right, women are often conditioned to, I'm not okay if my people are not okay. And I suspect that that has negative consequences for their own well-being, because if you have small children, if you have, a certain number of people in your family, there's always something that needs to be dealt with. And I think one of the hard parts about this is that one of my respondents described it as like a smartphone that you can never turn off, right? It's just constantly pinging you. It's not like you can put your brain in another room and say, I'm not going to think about any of these issues. I'm just gonna, read or do whatever for me, take inventory of myself. That's not something that most of the women that I interviewed felt like they could do.
So you have so many questions here. I'm going to try to get to them. I may end up doing some clustering, but let me pick up on a question here that I think builds on the earlier one. And that is from Tammy Wilson. Tammy, do you want to ask your question quickly, or should I just bring your idea into the conversation?
Hi, let's see. I have to scroll back up, see what
Well,
you have.
it was about making the invisible
Oh,
visible.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Because if this is so amazing, this presentation, but if we're working with invisible, the cloak of invisibility, our chances of in a couple by couple, they're pretty low because you don't know what you're working with. So, do you have any insights into that? Like, I know that you're working on like policy ideas. So, you know, I don't know. It just seems like there should be a very large headline that says make the invisible visible.
Yeah, absolutely,
Sorry, I
Tammy.
just want to draw a connection back to
Oh,
the
great.
comment about the non-promotable tasks, because part of that also in workplaces has been about making the invisible visible. That's been a theme in that lead. But please forgive me to cutting you off. Go, jump in.
Yeah, so Tammy, I think you're right. One of the things that's been interesting to me, so I mentioned briefly that I started this research in 2017. That's when I conducted the first round of interviews. And it feels like we're in a very different moment in 2025, just in terms of how far beyond academia these terms are spreading. So I do think that I talk about in the book that like the first step is we need to recognize that this is work, right? It's important work that needs to be done. Someone's doing it. I feel optimistic that as that continues to diffuse across society, right, it's going to be harder and harder for people to say like, I just didn't know that had to be done for the family. I do think part of it is that the circles in which these topics are discussed tend to be very, woman dominated, right? And so one of the things that I am hopeful is that we start to say this is not just a women's issue, right? This is a family's issue. This is an everybody issue, because I think that there's a lot of catharsis that comes from talking with someone else who shares in your struggle. But I think if we're going to affect change, right, we need to build broader coalitions and have broader conversations. But I got the sense, Tammy, that maybe there's a kind of personal angle in it. And so what I'll say is that I always recommend to couples that, make some intentional decisions, right? The first step has to be talking about, okay, what is our current allocation of physical labor and what is our current allocation of cognitive labor? Very few couples make intentional decisions about chores, right? Traditional chores. And very, very, very few couples make intentional decisions about cognitive labor. And it's quite hard to achieve your aims and values if you are not having that discussion ahead of time. So that's a really good place to start.
Thank you again. So I wanted to bring in Fernando Quijano, who is actually a doctoral student studying fathers. And so, Fernando, can we unmute you to ask your questions? You had a question and a couple comments here in the chat.
Hi. Thank you, Allison. I really enjoyed your presentation, and as I was reading through it or listening to it, it just felt like I was just nodding all the time with things that I've been looking towards my dissertation, where I'm looking exactly at this mental load, but I'm looking at what can husbands do to help reduce it, and then like these effects and works. So I think the first question I wanted to ask you was specifically for your interviews with non-traditional couples. What did you find about the men in those couples and how the ways that they either conducted themselves or what they learned and that allowed them to become more involved in a way that would reduce their wives' cognitive labor?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Fernando. So the man-led and balanced couples, they took a few different paths, right? So one path was a more intentional path. These are the couples that, I think, I strive to emulate in my own life, right? Where they set up their relationship and made core decisions at key turning points to pursue their values, right? They weren't necessarily thinking about it in terms of, okay, we want equal cognitive and physical labor, right? But they were thinking about it in terms of, we want both partners' careers to be fulfilling, right? We want both partners to feel like they're not overburdened at home. And then they sort of put their money where their mouth was, right? I had some couples who talked about how when it came time, one person was graduating, right? They thought really strategically about how they would make choices about where to move, right? If they moved for his job, that would create challenges for her, right? That might have trickle down consequences. The other thing I observed with those kind of intentional couples was they had a real comfort with sort of swimming upstream. I talk a lot in the book about how social norms still quite strongly promote different paths for mothers and for fathers in particular. And so these dads in those couples talked about how it was sometimes really awkward and challenging to be the only dad in X space, right? Or they felt weird with, being a very visible father, right? And they seem to have some sort of comfort. I don't know where exactly that came from with being okay, kind of going against the grain in that fashion. The other thing, and this was true of the second group of those non-traditional couples, where they didn't necessarily set out, right, with this intention to have, equality, balance, whatever. But what I saw in those couples was that they were flexible and they adapted to their changing circumstances. So for this group of couples, it was usually motivated by her career taking off in unexpected ways, and his career, stagnating or just not sort of keeping pace. And that was true in a lot of the couples that I interviewed, right? But only some of them actually changed their home life in response to those shifts. So something about sort of like looking at your circumstances, believing that you can change things, right? That it's not just a law of the universe that women do X for the home and men do Y, but like what would actually work for us? Those were a few things that I think might be, imitatable.
I'm going to try to collapse a couple of different questions here, and then hopefully we can get at least one or two more people on. But some of the questions relate, and Fernando had raised this early, to also what might be thought of as gatekeeping. Now, it could be gatekeeping by mothers, and that can take that. It sounds like a negative term, but it can come out in a more benign way, like a lot like what you're describing. This guy's a doofus, and like, it's kind of for the betterment of the family that I should take this on, and that is a theme in the fatherhood literature of men being kept out of fatherhood labor because whether or not it's the mother or other extended family members just sort of ridicule their fathering competencies. And then Laura Gee, if I'm understanding her question here, is also kind of saying, well, if women are doing so much of this, like on the margin, a little bit from the guy is maybe not all that helpful, and is that again, it's kind of part of this same dynamic. Did you see some of that where it's, more or less easier for me to do it than to try to train you or
Yes,
yeah.
yes. Yes, definitely. So on the gatekeeping, I I have a lot of conflicted thoughts on this. Like I'm familiar with this literature and I heard about, behaviors that would be classified as gatekeeping in my interviews. I think that the piece of it that I struggle with is like kind of this gendered accountability structures that oftentimes we don't take into account the fact that women face different pressures, right? So I actually think I cite some of Laura's work, if it's the same Laura, where, when there's a call from the school or the daycare, right? Who are those consequences going to fall on? If family are over for a holiday and the floor is not vacuumed, or, you didn't send a thank you card, right? Who's going to be blamed? So I think that, I try to put those gatekeeping behaviors in a broader context. That said, I have some other research along this line, but there's a whole genre of kind of husband bashing humor. And I think that it is I understand where that comes from, absolutely, but I do think that it helps to reinforce these ideas that men are bumbling and incapable, and I think that's insulting to men, and I think it also keeps us stuck in these patterns, and so that's something that I try to shy away from. Um, but yes, the point on, it is easier for me to just hold on to this myself came up over and over when I talked with people about, it sounds like you're unhappy with this. Why don't you try and shift it? And I don't think there's a way around it, right? We know that, practice makes, if not perfect, better. And a lot of this stuff is tied into relationships. It's, webs of knowledge that get built up over time. And so I think it's totally unreasonable to expect that you could just hand that all over to someone else of any gender and get the same results. And so I try to be honest about, that there is often a skills gap, one that is not necessarily innate, but that has emerged over the course of years. And everybody gets to make their own choices about, where they want to invest in building up one partner's skills, taking things off the other's plate. I think it's, those people who told me that it's easier to do it myself are in some ways right.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know if we have time, but I'd love to actually unmute Laura to join in this conversation. Her comment had partly prompted this. And then if we can also get in, maybe followed by that, Henrietta, you were talking about the connection to the workplace, because there are a lot of parallels. Like Lisa talks about women, in essence, specializing in these non-promotable tasks as the women are doing in the household labor. And that reinforces this cycle. Laura, I'd love to get you in, and then Henrietta, maybe we can hear from you about organizational interventions that may be relevant.
Sure. Nice to see you, Allison and Hannah. Sorry, so what did you want me to get to speak on exactly? Or
Oh, I don't know. You picked up at the end on the thing, and I was, if you wanted to elaborate on the
sure.
point.
I just wanted to say that actually, I wasn't so much speaking about I know there was a lot going on in the chat, so I can imagine it gets hard to tell. You mentioned, Allison, some research saying that like when men add more cognitive load, it doesn't hurt their mental status as much as women. And I was just kind of commenting on the idea. Hannah, you already spoke to this a little bit when you were talking about this with Allison, that it might be that women are so far past the fun and ownership part of more cognitive load that of course a little bit extra harms them. But men are actually maybe on the part of this where this is actually maybe even improving for them to feel a little bit more involved, a little bit more, whatever. And so it has to be like where you are on the curve. And I know, Hannah, you already spoke a little bit like about the slopes. So Allison, I'd love to get the site from you sometime about what that is.
Yes, I will dig that up definitely and follow up. Yeah, I think you're right, that I talk a bit in the book that this is not all burden, right? I asked people, if is there anything that you're currently holding on to that even if your partner begged to take it off your plate, you wouldn't want them to take it off? And most people had something, right? I want to plan my kid's birthday party. I want to be, the room parent, or usually it was something involved with their kids. And so I think that is not necessarily the problem we're solving for, right? It's all the stuff that feels like a burden and a slog. The other piece of this too that I want to comment on is that, it's I think this is where the emotional piece of it comes in, right? And the stakes. I think the emotional stakes of some of these tasks and whether they're done right and whether my kid is okay and whether my family is okay, hit differently for mothers and fathers, based on some of these social norms. So that's my other kind of hypothesis on that differential.
Thank you for clarifying, Laura. Yeah, that does make a lot of sense, Allison, that it could be waiting on them more because of your accountability explanation. You know what I mean? Like this really, that they feel the social pressure more than the father does. Henrietta, are we able to get you into the conversation?
Yep. Let me just. Well, thank you very much for your really interesting presentation. I was particularly taken with how detailed you were about what mental labor consists of. And I've been looking at a lot of job evaluation tools for pay equity purposes, like things coming out of New Zealand, which consisted in very intensive views of women's work and things like emotional labor and how that worked out in social work and things like that. But it would be great. I think your work could be a great resource for job evaluation specialists because they look at physical labor as valuable as emotional labor, as mental labor. And so, there's different degrees of that. And how can that be helpful in the workplace? I mean, some of those, like the New Zealand value of work tool, one of the qualifications is having a degree or having experience running a household. And there was also a Maori type of a skill set that involved doing work for the love of your community. And we often say like we want to have gender balance, diverse workplaces, and then they say, well, we want your lived experience, but what does that actually mean, right? What about me and my lived experience is helpful to the workplace? So I think your work is quite specific about that, right? It isn't up. Having had a kid myself, like I knew nothing about how to take care of a baby. I definitely upskilled during my leave, and my work was way better when I went back. But it's nice to be able to quantify that. And, like I work for the Canadian government, we get a bilingual bonus every year if we pass, second language test. But why wouldn't I get a bonus having the experience of, mental labor that I did on my leave? I wasn't doing nothing. Anyways, thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, that's a really interesting comment. And I think you're absolutely right that when we think about these as skills that are hard won, right? And when we have language to talk about the value they provide to our families, and could be applied in other directions, I talk sometimes about the other direction, right? That if we're trying to get increase men's participation in this at home, right? How can we think about what skills they already have in their paid work that would totally apply at home, right? And I think you're pointing us to the opposite direction. How can we think about the skills women are demonstrating at home and how valuable that is for workplaces? So thank you.
Allison, thank you so much for such a rich conversation. This was really wonderful. We obviously deeply resonated the home experience, but the connections to the conversations we've been having about work as well are very clear. We're so appreciative of your contribution to this seminar. Thank you. I hope you can see all the virtual applause. Please join in that. And please join us next week if you are able. We're going to hear from Tracy Dumas, Professor of Management and Human Resources at the Ohio State's Fisher College of Business. So please join us then. Thanks again, Allison. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.